are defined by the way we see ourselves, and that they should be implemented all over the world. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, this is not a secret. There was a great mood of Western triumphalism at the end of the Cold War. I saw it in Europe when I went to a meeting of foreign ministers of European Union and ASEAN. The then Belgian foreign minister, Willy Klaas, said, there are only two superpowers left in the world, America and Europe, and we will set the rules for the world. And in America, as you know, there was this incredible celebration of Francis Fukuyama's argument that all societies in the world now must immediately become liberal democratic. I mean, this is a distortion of Francis Fukuyama's argument, but that's what they wanted to believe. And in the process, the West failed to understand why it really succeeded in the battle against the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. It succeeded not because of its political system, it succeeded because of its economic system. And the real test of which was more important came at the end of the Cold War, when Russia and China took different routes. Gorbachev, unfortunately, bought the argument, the Western argument, and he said, hey, it's all about politics. So he changed the political system before changing the economic system, and that led to economic chaos in Russia. There was a huge economic implosion. Living standards went down, life expectancy went down, infant mortality rates went up, the various social indicators went negative, and the Russians suffered in the 1990s. And if you want to understand why Russians are so bitter towards the West today, they feel that at a time in the 1990s when they were really suffering, the West kept cheering them, saying, hey, Russia, you're doing a great job, you have democracy, and they were suffering. And that's why they resent these lectures from the West on democracy. By contrast, China took the opposite road. And Deng Xiaoping said, hey, it's not about politics, it's about economics. We must fix our economic system. So by focusing on transforming the economic system, China went through a spectacular growth. So clearly China understood what was a real factor that explained the West's success in the Cold War. Is all about transforming your economic system first, before you transform your political system.
You describe how freedom is understood in China, because one of the mantras of the Bush administration and America in this new phase is must have free and fair elections. There has to be freedom, the march of mankind to freedom. But there are different definitions of freedom, and if we don't understand that's problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think if you look at it from the point of view of the Chinese people, right? If you are living on less than $1 a day and you're struggling to feed your family, it makes no difference if you have any kind of political freedom or the right to vote if you can't feed your family. So from the Chinese people's point of view, when you look back over the last 150 years, they've gone through foreign invasions, the British coming to China saying, please, we want to buy your tea, accept our opium in return. And when the Chinese said no thank you, the British bombarded the Chinese, occupied parts of China, and insisted that the Chinese accept opium. So they've gone through hell over the last 150 years. Now, finally, for the first time in almost 2 centuries, the Chinese are experiencing this incredible improvements in their standard of living. And in China, the number of people living on less than $1 a day have fallen from 600 million to 200 million. So 400 million people, larger than the population of America, right, have seen a significant improvement in their lives. And what happens? You get greater freedom. You can finally go out and not face the stress of survival. You have choices to make. You can choose where to work. You can choose to buy television sets. You can choose to travel. And that's a remarkable improvement in your lifestyle. They're experiencing real personal freedom. And the real test of whether or not a society is free or unfree is when its people are allowed to go overseas. Do they come back or do they stay overseas? Right? Obviously, if China was a closed, dark, oppressive society, as soon as the Chinese could leave, they would leave and not come back. But guess what? Each year, over 20 million Chinese tourists travel overseas. And almost all of them come back to China. Why do they do that? Obviously, they have enough freedom to do what they want to do. Clearly, China hasn't achieved the political freedoms that America has, but it took America 200 years to achieve it. And maybe if you give China, maybe not 200 years, 100 years, they may achieve what the Americans did in 200 years. But the other more controversial point that I would like to make here is that the Americans assume that they will always remain defenders of freedom, no matter what. But if you look at what America did after 9/11, you look at the erosion of civil liberties in America, you look at the way the Americans are prepared to accept the Patriot Act, it's clear that when the Americans feel threatened, they too walk away from many of the freedoms that they celebrate. And the most astounding thing, the most shocking thing that America did after 9/11, by the way, was to practice torture. And this has come as a huge shock to the rest of the world. They said, how can this land, the beacon of freedom, the beacon of human rights and so on and so forth, take this major step backwards and begin to practice torture? It's almost as bad as America going back to re-implement slavery again, because it was the move away from slavery. It was the move to delegitimize torture. These were great leaps forward in the battle for human rights. And America, the leading defender of human rights, suddenly began to practice torture. And you can imagine how shocked the rest of the world is. And the rest of the world is saying to America, you no longer have any moral authority to give lectures to anybody on any human rights questions, because you have failed your own test.
You do a very interesting analysis of the way things have turned in the sense of Western hypocrisy, the Western changes in their attitude toward the very global institutions that they created. And I want to explore that now, because the sense of that is part of what you call the de-Westernization process, namely as Asia rises and it sees things like the American Record on Torture, there is a delegitimation of the placement on the top of the mountain, to use your metaphor. Now, early in your book, you quote Samuel Huntington, and Samuel Huntington says, the West, in effect, is using international institutions, military power, and economic resources to run the world in a way that will maintain Western predominance, protect Western interests, and promote Western political values. Is that the new change?
Yes, I think as a result of the shift of power to Asia, the West has got to make some major decisions now. It's, in a sense, has got to choose between its narrow short-term interests in protecting its positions of predominance in many global institutions and its longer